participation, but I'm very glad that you could come and you are here. And of course, I'm very glad that we are all here on this side. Now let me introduce myself. First of all, I'm Stefano Baldi. I'm Minister Plenipotentiary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Rome. And as you probably know, I hope you know why you are here. I always hope that people knows why they come. But we have this session, very interesting session of the Festival della Diplomazia of this year. This is the 15th year of the festival, as you've probably seen or you have heard. And every year the festival has a title, as a theme. This year the theme is power. In fact, the title is Looking for Kratos. And when Giorgio Bartolomucci, that I always thank because he's the mastermind of the Festival di Diplomazia, told me, you know who Kratos is? And I said, yes, but I didn't know. Is the god of power, he is explained to me in the Greek mythology. And it's interesting to have this kind of old reference for something which is very contemporary. And so in the whole program of the festival this year is about different declination of this power. And today, the title of today is International Institutions, Ideology and Real Powers. So it's quite a challenge. It's very interesting theme. And I'm glad that I'm here as a moderator because I will learn with you many of the different thinking or interpretation of this around this theme. I will try to add here and there my experience. I have mainly multilateral experience, so I have diplomatic experience in international organizations. So I hope that I will be able to give my contribution to the discussion today. Of course, I also want to thank. I thanked already Giorgio Bartolomucci, but I want to thank also the Center for American Studies, which is hosting this event and many other events of the festival. Is hosting you in this wonderful place. And let me also now introduce the most important part of our discussion, which is the panelists. They will contribute. They will be the real issue, or they will provide to us thinking and different aspects on discussion on this. I go in the order from the right. I have Professor Jeffrey Checkle. He comes from the European University Institute in Fiesole. He's American. He has all of them. They have a lot of studies behind, and you will learn about them by the time they will talk, and they will see few words on each one of them. So Professor Checkle is graduated in applied physics, but he has a PhD in political science from the MIT, which is always a myth when we say MIT, you know, you open every door. But currently we are lucky enough because he has been teaching in different universities, but he is now he has joined now the European University Institute, which is in Fiesole, near Florence. It's a wonderful place to do research and to study. So I envy him very, very much. If you look at the books he's published, you can find a long list. I just went to Amazon, and this is only, I think, a small part, because I'm sure what Amazon shows, it's only a small part, and is very much into the process. Is in the notes they wrote, it's a pioneer of process tracing in political science and constructivist method. I'm sure he will explain to us very much more about this during his intervention. Then we have on my right, Christina Stoeckel. She's full professor at the Lewis University. So in principle, she's coming from a close place, but of course she has a long experience in many different countries. She has worked in the university in Innsbruck. She also has taken a PhD from the European University Institute, the same that I mentioned before, and she has a lot of publications as well. But I want to draw your attention on one specific, which is L'Internazionale Moralista. In fact, it is the Italian translation from the book, which is The Moral Russia in the Global Culture Wars. And by the way, this is the book that you will be able to find in Italian after we are finished in the room nearby. So if you're interested, so it's up to you to convince them that it's worthwhile. I'm sure it will be, because there are really many aspects that you will be able to touch. Of course, this has to deal more specifically with politics and religion. But as you were mentioning before while we were speaking, there are so many connections of this with the situation, and also with international institutions. Then, last but not least, as we always say, is Professor Michael Frieden. Michael Frieden, he comes from Oxford, so he's the one who has been covering more road to come here. But I'm glad. So special thank to you for coming. He knows Rome already, so I think it was a good occasion to come back. But we will have the privilege to hear you. He is a doctor. He's the supervisor currently of the Doctor of Philosophy in Political Theory at the University of Oxford. And again, to get to that point, I think you have covered along many other positions and activities, and in fact, is a long list of studies that you have done, and also prizes I see that you have received for all your studies. Let me also mention that you got the something also from Italy, the Medal of Science from University of Bologna. So we are very proud that you also recognized here. So it was very much. Also, a long list of books, and I'm sure that he will more specifically look into the ideology, political theories, how they are linked to all this. But each one of our lectures, of our panelists today, is an expert on issues which I think, I'm not sure they are complementary. Not only complementary, there are different perspectives of analyzing what is the situation in international institutions, what I always call international organizations. Maybe they are not exactly always the same thing. But still, for me, being a diplomat, I always see, when I mention this kind of words, multilateral diplomacy. That's what it is for me. But then maybe you will see it from a different perspectives. The idea is to have kind of first round. Then I will just use my power by the way of power, to have some specific questions, and then we will open up for your questions. Or your observations, or whatever you have in mind. I think this should work out in the time we have, hopefully. And so this will give us the opportunity to even interact a little bit among ourselves and with you. So that's the intention. And if you allow me, I would just ask Professor Checkle to make a small introduction, more or less 10 minutes. That's what we agreed, and then I will continue from there. Thank you.
it's all a bit slightly difficult when this is my writing. Well, the mic's on, right? Okay, good. Okay. So yeah, so we're talking about international institutions, ideology, and real powers. I guess that's the title, right? And actually, in preparing my comments, I sort of reworded the title. So here's the new title for me: International Institutions, Their Failing Ideologies and Declining Real Powers. Oops. And if you sort of know sort of people who study international institutions, you might think I'm a realist, right? Saying that these are the kind of people who don't think international institutions do much in global politics. But actually, I mean, Stefano mentioned this constructivism stuff. I mean, I'm coming from the kind of theoretical school that thinks international institutions are a real force in international politics, and often a force for good. But I'm also sort of very empirical. I sort of look at what's happening in the world. And sort of the big takeaway of my comments here is international institutions, their power and ideology are in decline. And the outcome is overdetermined. That's a nerdy political social science phrase. It just means there's all kinds of factors pushing in the same direction, which are sort of leading to this decline in the powers and ideology of international institutions. And I'm going to point at 1, 2, 3, 4 factors, okay, causing this decline. First one has to do with nation states. Okay. Second one has to do with nation states in a different way. Third has to do with these international institutions. And the fourth is actually all of us, sort of civil society. I'll do this in 10 minutes. But just before I begin, just a couple definitions. I mean, sort of Stefano actually already did the first one for me. When I hear the word international institutions, I'm going to use the word international organization today. Okay, universal international organization like the United Nations, regional organizations, NATO, African Union, ASEAN and Asia. I mean, okay, so and I'll probably often say international organization or regional organization. So that's how I'm sort of operationalizing international institution. Ideology, I mean, so what is that? That's a set of beliefs on which people, parties, maybe international organizations, partly base their actions. In my discipline, international relations, we don't really talk about the ideational power of international organizations. We more normally say, we talk about the norms and values they promote. So that's the kind of language I will use, norms and values. Okay, so let's get to the story of decline, I guess, which I'm not happy to say, right? But this is what I see going on. Okay, so the first culprit, right, are nation states. Okay, this is nation states Mark 1, and I call this, we are still in charge, not international institutions. Well, international organizations, right? I mean, they're called intergovernmental organizations, right? They're created and run by nation states, okay? So they have a lot of say in what these organizations do. States can ignore what international organizations do. So we have a bit of a problem in the South China Sea these days with China asserting control, sovereignty over lots of stuff, right? The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, about 8 years ago, issued a ruling in favor of the Philippines, and I think it was that case. Now China, under international law, this stuff is not yours. China just ignores it. The ICJ right now, right, there's a proceeding against Israel that's been started for what's been going on in Gaza. And the ICJ has issued some, I'm not sure what the language is, recommendations to Israel, which are being ignored. So, states can just ignore what these organizations do. Nation states can just say, bug off, okay? So, the culminating, the Framework Convention, the UN Framework Convention on the Environment, right, which really sort of finally came together with the Paris Agreement of 2016, 2015, 2016, and the US signed up, right, in 2017, bye-bye. Trump kind of ripped it up, basically. And we withdrew a year later. And we're back in again because Joe Biden came, and then 2 weeks from now, right, we'll probably be ripping up the convention again. So that goes on, right? States can create facts on the ground that sort of render irrelevant IO policy. So right now in southern Lebanon, there's UNIFIL, UN. It's there. It's a UN peacekeeping force authorized by the Security Council, and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, if you've been watching or listening to news the last week now, and the IDF are creating facts on the ground. The IDF is sort of blowing through the gates of UNIFIL quarters in this buffer zone. And Netanyahu is saying publicly, please get out, or not please, get out of there, or you're going to be harmed. He doesn't really have a right to say that. It's the Security Council to put them there. But I mean, this goes on, right? So states can do this. Okay, so that's one sort of, the bad guys that what nation states are doing. The second part of the nation state story is a bit more complicated. And I call this, okay, we, the nation states, we like international organizations so much, we're going to take them over from the inside or maybe create new ones. So the inside job, right? Powerful states can shape the leadership of these institutions in their own image and control them. So the Bretton Woods institutions that were created at the end of World War II, it's baked into the constitutional structure that one of them, which one is it? IMF, has to be run by an American. One has to be run by a European, right? I mean, it's just baked into the structure, right? The voting rights make no sense. They made sense back in, what was it, 1946? They don't anymore, but they persist, okay? China more recently has systematically moved Chinese nationals into a number of high-ranking positions in the UN system. Okay, so big, powerful states can do this, right? You don't hear about Norway muscling their people in, or Singapore, but they're not the big and powerful. The other thing international big states can do is let's create more international institutions if we don't like the ones we have. So China is very actively creating a second set of financial developmental international organizations in Asia. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a good example, which kind of replicate things that are being done by existing international organizations. And I'm not saying they don't have a right to do this. They do, and maybe have very good reasons to do this, but this is going on. Russia, China came together to create the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's about 20 years ago, which kind of completely replicates what the OSCE does in many ways. So in this states, nation states, like, by working from within or creating all really duplicate international organizations can, I would argue, lead to a decline in their overall power. Third thing that's going on that's leading to this decline, now the blame shifts to international organizations themselves. And the argument here is when a gap opens between the norms and values an international organization promotes and its on-the-ground practice, the IO is weakened. And here we'll take an example close to home, the European Union. It's portrayed itself as not a humanitarian superpower, but a very special kind of international organization that takes human rights very seriously. For over 40 years now, it's talked about that we have something called a European identity. That's a inclusive identity. There's space for a lot of peoples within it. Yeah, but since 2015, 2016, I mean, sort of those values clash with the EU's practice and policies on migrants and asylum seekers, okay? Basically creating unwanted other, okay? Building physical walls, they're back really big time, including within Schengen, and Schengen is sort of collapsing, right, as we talk. The Frontex, the EU's border control, border force, right, has been authorized to do complete violation of international law, these so-called pushback policies. And they're not the only ones doing it. My country's doing a very good job on the southern border with Mexico. But, on the one hand, the European Union is saying, okay, we stand for this, we're good, we're inclusive, right? But then you look at the practice on the ground, it's very different. And that what I argue also weakens the international organization. Final point. So at this point, I blamed everyone else, right? Nation states, international organizations. Now I'm blaming us. Okay. Global civil society, that's us. Okay. And I'm going to argue they're turning against international organizations. And I have to make sort of a really crude division here: Northern global civil society and global civil society in the South. So in the northern part of the globe, right, you see this backlash against globalization. The institutions that made for free, open economies. And this has created winners and losers across the global north, right? I mean, this is a part of politics in most countries, in my country, America, right? It's a huge part of Trump's base of support, sort of the losers from globalization. There's also anger at the global north, and this is really big in Europe, but also maybe a bit also in North America. International institutions promote these open borders, and look what's flooding in. All these people we don't want, right? Now, there's a fact fiction element here because, international institutions actually do not promote open borders. But the problem is politicians like Trump, a number of politicians in Europe promote this myth that they do. And the net effect is, I mean, it erodes the standing of these international organizations. That's sort of northern civil society turning against these international organizations. Civil society in global South, well, they've actually had a beef correctly for about, 50 years. That sort of the global order we created, the liberal international order, we like to call it in the global north, is filled with hierarchy, exclusion, and non-universal values. And they're right. Okay. So there is no fact fiction dynamic here. They've been correctly upset about their place in it for decades. Yeah, so the conclusion, bottom line, in terms of values, norms, ideologies, I would argue the values, norms of all too many international organizations are increasingly misaligned with an angry and inward-looking global north and an increasingly empowered global south. In terms of power, the power of IIs, international organizations, is being eroded both from within, hypocrisy, double standards, and from without, states taking back control. And I'll just close by saying, it's tempting to listen to me and say, oh, this is an argument, it's presentism. And what we mean by that, it's like, I look at the present and, the present right now doesn't look very good for global politics, period, right? Or the role of international organizations. And so I sort of read back, right? And sort of say, well, this has been the story, for a long time. Well, I'm not reading back. These are secular trends that have been developing at least since the end of the Cold War, sort of the early 1990s. And if I'm right about that, then, it's not like we just have to get past Trump and a few other politicians, right? And things will get better again. I'm afraid this is a longer term that's not going to be easy to reverse. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Checkle. Thank you, Jeff. It was very interesting. And of course, I will not react because I want to give temptation is there on a few issues, but we will have time later to confront. But let me start from of course your last or the beginning and also the end of your intervention, which is this declining trend. When of course if you talk about something which is declining, it means that in the past it was different, it was better. And so there is a dynamics. So this introduced me to what I would like to ask to the two of you. So how the international institutions or international organizations, as we have said, are now adapting to many challenges, to these dynamics, to so many different situations, so many different inputs. In the presentation, for those who have read the presentation, there are many elements which are mentioned. You know, the technology, the economic developments. This is of course putting under stress also international organizations. So how do you think they are adapting, and how do you see the future for multilateralism in this kind of world which is so much changing and which is more and more polarized as it is always perceived? How do you see it? I will first ask Christina Stöckel, and then I will.
All right, so thank you very much for the challenging question, and I think I kind of start where Jeffrey Jekyll ended, on the point of norms and values, and I think again it's important to realize that the international institutions, the international organizations that we are talking about, were created after the Second World War as platforms to bridge a polarized world. And so we are talking about polarization today, but we shouldn't forget how extremely polarized the world was with the onset of the Cold War. And so the idea was that international organizations could be platforms, they could be bridges, they could be guardians of an idea of a kind of universal conversation that could be held across divides that were fundamental between Soviet Union and the free market West, between global South and the North before these words were used. So that there could be organizations that stood for a rule-based international order and an interaction. So that was the idea, that these international organizations are platforms. And I think this is the idea that is now in discussion for the reason that Jeff pointed out. Namely that now more and more in international affairs, the international institutions themselves are no longer seen as platforms for all, but as actors themselves. And so they become implicated in the conflict and in the polarization. And I will now, from that high level of reflection, go to a very, very concrete example that you may find a little puzzling. But I come to this topic and to this panel as a sociologist. I'm actually a sociologist of religion. I do something very specific. And my field of expertise is the Russian Orthodox Church. So an even much more specific corner of the world of studies of religious actors. And as I was studying that field, which is interesting because with the end of the Soviet Union, religion in Russia became again an important factor to influence politics. So one thing as I was studying the field and this case was that I noticed that the Russian Orthodox Church is starting to use the language of human rights in order to put its claims vis-a-vis the state and inside civil society. And also in its international relations, in its church diplomacy. And why was this church using the language of human rights, if at the same time it had also claimed that orthodoxy is actually not part of the whole civilization, the world, the idea of the Enlightenment that gave rise to the notion of human rights? And then there was a specific link that made that argument possible. And it's a link that you find in the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in an article further down the row, in Article 29. If you go to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and you find Article 29, it says that human rights should be accorded with the understandings, the morality, the moral standards in a democratic society. So there was an idea that the universality of human rights had a kind of linkage to the collectivity. Human rights are about individual rights, but this Article 9 creates a link to the values and notions that are relevant for a collectivity. But the article has the word democratic inside. So the diplomats of the Russian Orthodox Church very early on, already in 2008, 2009, started saying, we are not against human rights and we are not against a world order based on human rights as a principle, but these human rights must have limits. And these limits are to be found in the collectivity. And then they drew out of the hat a new word, which is not in the declaration, and that was tradition. The word traditional values. And those of you who study and who are maybe more interested in what is happening in Russia may have realized that the word traditional values is now in basically every single document that the government has put out in terms of international relations. It's in the Russian national security doctrine. And it's it's even in the constitution now, the amended constitution of 2020. And so why is this relevant for the question of international institutions? Because it is precisely through this idea that human rights themselves are not really universal. Individual human rights are not universal, but they have to be bound back to a collectivity, to a community. They have to be set limits. That international institutions advocating a universal idea of human rights become no longer platforms, but actors of a particular idea, of a liberal idea of human rights. And that's the one that now actors like Russia and people who, and countries that follow that line want to argue against. The human rights idea and traditional values made its way into the United Nations. Because between 2012 and 2015, Russian diplomats promoted a resolution to be voted on in the United Nations Human Rights Council entitled Traditional Values as Limits to Human Rights. It was a very successful resolution by UN standards because it passed with a majority many times. Now, you know that inside the United Nations Human Rights Council resolutions, in the end, they don't really have an effect, but they set the topic, they set the theme, and that theme of collectivity, collective values, particularistic values, being able to set a limit to international human rights gained traction. And in that context, the international institutions that we once thought about as being platforms and bridges, and in that sense, in a way, maybe the places where a conflict between a more individualistic understanding and a more collective understanding of human rights could be worked out, that was no longer the case. In the context of that debate over the resolution, the UN itself became an actor advocating for the an individualist understanding, and it was that was under critique. So what we actually at that point now have is that it's international institutions no longer as platforms, but as being in a way implicated in a conflict that in another setting, in a more sociological setting, has also been called a culture war. So it's really a war over norms and values. And I think you realize that in that sense, the international institutions will not easily get out of that situation. Because once we have abandoned the idea of being able to have a platform where to meet and to work out difficult questions, then all we're really left with is a struggle. And the word multilateralism, that sounds nice, but the multilateralism, where does it take place? If it doesn't have a place where it will then be worked out, we really only have a conflict or I don't like to use the word, but maybe to use it here again, a type of culture war. So the last point I want to make, and this is also the topic of the book that that Stefano kindly mentioned, The Moralist International, Russia and the Global Culture Wars, is that this discovery of Article 29 of setting limits to human rights through traditions wasn't actually something that the Russian Orthodox Church had come up with by itself. It's something that was in a way taken over from debates that are more connected in a way to a conservative opposition to liberalism, very much connected to debates inside the West, and indeed extremely normal. Because in every democratic society, it is normal that people disagree over what is the good life, and that they disagree on whether it's really more the pursuit of individual interests or whether it's more the pursuit of collective interests that expresses it most. And democratic institutions are actually there to work that out, to find compromises, and to find periods where the one or the other prevails. That's what democracy is all about. But if we take a step further and then we actually start to see this normal disagreement and confrontation over values as being on a global level, not a confrontation, but actually a war, a culture war, where one side has to win and the other has to lose. And where one side is sort of represented in international organizations, in progressive NGOs and civil society, and the other feels represented by countries that criticize their international organizations, that claim that they stand for traditionalism, for sovereignty, and for religion, even though religion is found on both sides, but that's hardly said. So if we end up in a situation like that, then we are in a conflict of culture war, and we've actually implicated the platforms that were created. We've lost them. They've become part of the struggle. So I finished my 10 minutes, but that's, I look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. It was very interesting approach. I put down some notes on what you said. And it's interesting how you can see, things differently once they are presented under a different light, perspective. And I think it was a very interesting way to put it, even with the example of Russia and the religion and how this affects human rights. It was a nice way, and I'm sure there will be more reflection on this. And now let me move to Professor Frieden, to Michael Frieden. I'm sure we will have some more interesting food for thought from your reflections and your analysis. Please.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you all for coming. That's very generous of you to spend your time here. I want to react in part to the question that Dr. Baldi asked a few moments ago. And I repeat it, how international institutions adapting to contemporary global challenges, what does the future hold for multilateralism in an increasing polarized world? And I want to begin by unpacking three words. I will also relate in part to what my predecessors have talked about. The three words I want to unpack are polarity, global or globalization, and multilateral. All very problematic words. So polarity conjures up a world of binaries and of dichotomies, which is a very common, but also very misleading way of superimposing system on the world. And it's in part a relic of the grand theory that still affected the Titanic interwar clashes and the Cold War confrontations. The dual assault of fascism and communism from the 1930s almost, from the 1920s almost, their assault on democratic culture and practices cast a shadow over the way people think about these terms and the forces that align around such issues. And they created certain expectations about what characterized state behavior, governmental behavior, and ideologies. So in the longer run, these were anomalies because words and phrases are great simplifiers, and they're often unintentional distorters. But of course, also it's the case that political language exercises immense power that so-called facts on the ground, I put this in inverted commas, facts on the ground, cannot match. The power of words is very often far superior to the power of so-called facts on the ground. And if we move now to the terms global and globalization, these terms seriously underplay the normal fissures, the fractures, and the divergences that continuously swirl in front of our eyes. And even if some challenges are global, I mean, climate change is undisputably global, the impacts of those changes are not global, and the interpretations that they attract are not global. And interpretation, for me, is the name of the game. So what we are witnessing here is a fourfold tug of war between the unifiers and universalizers, e.g. the wishful mission of organizations such as the United Nations. Then we have the pluralizers, which are forces inside states who push for diversity. Then we have the regionalizers. And then we have the obdurate contesters, those who conduct endlessly shifting battles to finalize competitive alliances which are all doomed to fail in the long run. And note that even the word multilateralism is about sides, lateral. Evokes boundaries, divides. So stepping up to the level of international organizations does not protect us from their takeover by lateralism. If we go back to universalism, the fatal attraction of universalism is that it collapses both space and time. Indeed, it makes them invisible. And many regard this as a hallmark of ethical completeness and perfection. And it seems to conjure up a tremendously exciting and revealing vision. But indulging in this kind of vision also produces profoundly tragic consequences. Because if the microphone, because if what is true everywhere is also true always, rather than holding out hope for both individuals and societies, this perfect universalism condemns people to experience repeated cycles of disappointment and frustration because they're always unattainable. It reminds me of the famous critique of Marx by Ludwig Feuerbach, who complained that what Marx was doing was to turning men into gods and thus removing them from the level from the concrete world, from the level of critique and the level of simple understanding what they are. So as an unintended side effect, universalism bestows the kiss of death on disciplines such as history and anthropology and sociology, for example. And most strikingly, the search for universalism dehumanizes us by conferring unassailability on our ideas, by sanctifying them, by sending them into orbit, where they remain forever out of reach, out of our grasp on this one-way trip to immortality. Now, universalism also is linked up to a number of related terms. For example, cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is a rather different term, though. We're talking here about a concrete view of human interconnectivity that aims at enveloping people and their societies under the welcoming embrace of belonging to a community. And cosmopolitanism is also a spatial statement. It's about space. It's about the common space that we inhabit. Globalism, on the other hand, or its process, which is globalization, is a far narrower and ethically shaky enterprise. To begin with, globalization always involves the gathering of unequals, because the distribution of power resources on this planet is unequal. And it relates to an ostensibly free market that is far from free. So what we have in globalization, in fact, is an unrestrained concentration of economic power. And this moral universalism of vision, of comprehensiveness, or of equal opportunity is crowded out by ideas about globalization. It's a globalism of super conglomerates. It's a globalism that is characterized by power-hungry expansion that is found sometimes incongruously called muscular liberalism by its conservative adherents. So globalism masquerades. I need 3 hands for this, sorry. I forgot my 3rd hand in Oxford. Globalism seems to conjure up immeasurable material advantages, but these advantages are reaped only by very small segments of populations. And therefore, globalism is no substitute for cosmopolitanism. So what about liberalism? And we mentioned, I'll come back to this in a second or two. Liberalism has never been universal. And I always prefer to talk about liberalisms in the plural. There are liberalisms and there are socialisms and the conservatisms that one can never, one needs to look at the microstructure of these ideas. So like any ideology, liberalism has its usurpers and its misrepresenters. And to go back to the phrase that Jeffrey used earlier in his talk, the liberal world order, which you use critically and not without reason. The liberal world order is a rather dangerous term for its misleading complacency, because the liberal world order is pursued by governments that are very rarely liberal when they participate in this so-called liberal world order. So you have a very minimal idea of what liberalism is here, a minimalist notion of liberalism. It catapults a market notion of liberalism rather than a humanist, developmental, individualist notion of liberalism. And it's formulaic rule of law. Rule of law sounds wonderful, but rule of law also papers over vast differences. It conceals more than it reveals. And finally, on this matter, we are always in danger of conflating states and governments. States have no policies. States don't do anything, in a way. It's governments that policies and have the plans and have the activities. States are abstract structures. So let me just finish with a couple of observations here. Liberalism, like all creeds, like all beliefs, is a provincial system. And I think you mentioned this earlier. It emanates from a particular region of the globe. It is located in particular set of historical developments. And the differences over the beliefs and values within liberalism is actually extremely productive. Differences rather than the singularity of a liberal world order that we must take into account. So just to sum up on multilateralism, multilateralism is a very incomplete step to a very imperfect world, when what is required is an increasing extra state and intersocial connections, at least partially bypassing conventional structures.
That's a very challenging final statement, Professor. I must confess to you that when you said that states are abstract structures and government decides, I completely agree with you. But being a diplomat, you know, I have some problems because I represent a state, not a government. And that's why I am, you know, nominated by our, in our case, by our president of the republic and not by our prime minister. So I get your point, but you know, you understand also where I come from when I tell you that for me, I feel like a state. And if I go back to states for our second round, now a little bit more specific, when I listen initially to the 4 points that Jeffrey mentioned on the explanation for facts, on the explanation of declining of international organizations, let's say, one of them was member states, of course, but still, what came to my mind is a title of a book which was published, well, a bit less than 20 years ago, about the UN. I was at the UN at that moment in New York. And this very good Italian journalist published a book which is titled Mirror of the World, Lo specchio del mondo. That's what it was his definition, or his best definition of the UN. I mean, UN as such is just what the member states mainly decide to do. This is valid for every international organization. Is that true? It's not true. You mentioned that it's partially true, Jeffrey. But what I say, and this is you know, what my question to you in a way. I think that still most of the fact that international organizations are considered not effective. We could discuss if they are efficient. That we could discuss why. But in terms of effectiveness, there's a lot of criticism, of course. How much of this is really due to the lack of political will of member states, and this was another element of the fact that national interest prevails on a vision that should in fact be the drive of having an effective international organization. Up to you.
Okay, so thanks for pushing me to, I guess, clarify a bit about, you know, what these member states of these international organizations are doing. I mean, there's sort of various ways to cut into this issue of the relationship of the nation states that comprise international organizations and what the international organizations do, what degree of autonomy they get from, or do they get any autonomy from the member states? And that's an ongoing big discussion in my disciplines. And, over time, some international organizations have gained greater autonomy from the member states. Others are very much, what's the word? Not controlled, but I mean, a function, to use your language, of the political will or lack of political will of member states. So the United Nations, right, is, what's the word? Frozen, falling apart's too strong, right? It's run by this anachronism, the Security Council, the victors of a war that was, 75 years ago. And nobody has any, the permanent members of the Security Council, which is their veto, right? There's not sufficient political will. For 25 years now, we've been talking about this reform of the Security Council. And it's not going to happen because the P5 don't want it to happen, right? So, I guess what you're pushing me, maybe you're not pushing me, but I could make my argument even stronger that, it's the reason international organizations are in crisis, that's my words now, these days, maybe even has more to do with the member states running them, to use your language. They've lost interest in organizations, or they have a vested interest with the P5, the Security Council, of staying in control, right? Not let anybody else. And it increasingly erodes seriously the legitimacy of the organization, right? They have to see this. They don't care, right? Because they can keep running it, right? And the UN just is in permanent, eternal crisis because of this. And then on top of that, there are things the UN has done where DPKO, Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which has had to play and grow into a very important role in the period after the end of the Cold War. This department, has some much greater degree of autonomy from member states, and the story of the peacekeeping operations that have come out of DPKO is not always I don't know what the word is, a good one. So, there's multiple things going on, like with the UN, where you're right, the P5, the 5 countries kind of controlling the place. It's not so much they've lost their political will, they just want to stay in charge, right? And not adapt the institution to the world we have today. But on top of that, you have a very large international organization like the UN, which has grown in its competencies, partly because of demands the world has put on it. And sometimes it executes those competencies in not the best way. So it just compounds the overall picture that, the organizations are not working well.
No, on the reform of the Security Council, I can tell you I was there in 2002. I started, and it was already the discussion on uniting for consensus, which I was really very much part of. And I do agree with you that, again, if the will is not there, you always will find some good reasons why you should not do it. And one very strong reason is just power. Again, we go back to power. I mean, those who have power why should they share it? So it's a catch-22 situation for sure. And but there is another thing that I wanted to share with all the three of you on the declining of international organizations, the crisis. There are two considerations I think they should keep in mind. First of all, even if they're not so effective, international organization is the best that we have. There is no replacement. You can replace it with another international organization, as you were saying before. Yes, Shanghai. I mean, they're trying to, recreate some different, but it's not something new. There's nothing else. And second of all, we like it or not, it's very difficult to close down an international organization. There are very, very few examples, and those few examples they've been replaced by something else. So international organizations are there to stay. We should make the best use of them. And of course, there is another thing that we should consider on the positive side, I think, is that each organization, I mean, I know very well OSCE because I just finished there in Vienna, but you can take OECD, UN, and in UN you have so many, as you all know, that it's a number of them. Each organization in these many years, let's take after the Second World War, they have piled up a lot of norms, a lot of principles that now we take more or less for granted, or we cry that they are not respected, but they have been decided, they have been settled there. I mean, the so-called acquis, which is not only the acquis communautaire, but also the acquis of each international organization, is something that is there. And the organization can decline, but that will stay in a way. It will be attacked, like we have now in OSCE, but it's there. And this is a very good reason why we should really understand why, even if they are not so effective as we would like to be, they are so important. One protagonist that has been mentioned, and it's even for the UN, is Russia. Of course, you mentioned it before, and Russia has a very important role in every organization where it is present, which is most of them, not all, but most, not in the EU, at least directly. But I would like to ask Christina a little bit more on this relationship that you mentioned before of religion and power, and how this affect the attitude also of Russia internationally. Because you have used one term somewhere, which is conservative norm entrepreneur, which I like very much, but I'd like you to develop a little bit more related to the Russian analysis that you know very well.
Okay, no, thank you. Again, I just as a start, there's this idea that international institutions can be platforms where states that don't have the same vision can actually meet and work things out. And that may work sometimes less or worse, but we have international organizations as places where they meet. And throughout the Cold War, certainly Western states and states within the Soviet Union and associates, they didn't have the same goals and they didn't think about many issues in the same way, but they didn't fundamentally put into question the existence of international organizations as places and platforms. And I think what we are witnessing today is actually a putting into question the very usefulness and the very existence of international organizations as platforms. And the way, I mean, this happens on many different levels. But one way in which it happens is interestingly the one where religion then comes into the picture. Because let's take very concretely Russia. as the Russian Federation in a way as the successor state of the Soviet Union, it has really switched position in the global ideological structure in a very particular way. The Soviet Union was that center and power with which the global left associated. And it was also that, certainly in the 1920s and 30s, that power where a movement like the Communist International would find its source and program from. And now when in the book that I co-authored with my Russian colleague, we use the term the Moralist International. We do, of course, play on that. Because what has actually happened is that the Russian Federation under the President Putin since 2012 has in a way become the center for a completely different ideological side. Namely, we defend traditional values, we defend religion, and we actually get political powers on the right, even on the very far right, in Europe, but also elsewhere, that look to that Russia with hope or with admiration. So what has actually happened? How has that happened? That Russia today is a moral conservative norm entrepreneur in only really 30 years. And of course, that what has happened is that the Russian state has played the card of religion and has played the card of we are actually those defending religious traditional values vis-a-vis a West that is secular and losing in the sort of secular and losing values, which is a mystification because that's actually not the case. But again, here also you see how this really switched, sort of where we were looking at the Soviet Union, which was actually the country where religions were repressed. And we now go to a Russian Federation that says about the West, you are now the ones that are not respecting religion and traditional values. So how has this recoding in a way of a global ideological conflict taken place? And I mean, I think we can describe with process tracing and other types of analysis how the coding has taken place. I think we can see how it has taken place, but the understanding how it happened doesn't still yet tell us how we should get out of it or how we should deal with it. But I think values and norms matter in international relations and positions taken and expressed in the language of values and norms. And, you know, it gets as simple as that, you know, Vladimir Putin can say in a speech, well, we are defending the traditional family and the West is only defending LGBTI rights. It gets as concrete as that, how the language of values and norms is being used. And I think it's here where, you know, we are all in front of a very big challenge. Because what I said before, that what is normal in a democratic society, namely trying to work out difficult moral questions, trying to work out the you know, different impulses to individual fulfillment or to collective values. These are questions that have to be worked out in a society. But if you blow them up and you turn that into the ground of a global confrontation, and then you start associating countries with one position and that with the other, you've actually stopped being able to work out anything. And this is, I think, what's happening. And this is why I wouldn't even, they are not only moral conservative norm entrepreneurs, they're of course also progressive norm entrepreneurs. And to a certain extent, they're guilty of the same thing. So what is in a way part of the story is also the transnationalization of the conflict, the globalization of the conflict, that then really makes situations lose ground where then in a local or more concrete context solutions can be worked out and compromises can be worked out. So that's in a way the transnationalization, the going beyond the state can often also be part of the problem and not necessarily of the solution.
Thank you, Christina. Again, a lot of food for thought and reflection. I'd like to take a couple of points. One point that you mentioned at the beginning on the creation of international organizations. In fact, in many of the cases of the creation of international organizations, and we have to remember this, was among countries which were not like-minded. Sometimes we consider the failure of an organization because there is no agreement, or there is no common ground, or there is disagreement on the way you see the same topic, the same value. But in fact, this was the starting point for many of the organizations. It's nothing new. So we should not, of course, as Western world, if we can define this, we are very frustrated by the fact that there is no full recognitions of some of the values that we have been fighting for, and we are still working on, and because we are not, none of us is in the perfect situation. But in fact, if there are other countries which do not still agree or will never agree, it's something that we should not be surprised, because it's part of the game, how it started. And then, of course, you mentioned ideologies related to values and norms. And this brings me, of course, to Professor Frieden, because I would like him to go a little bit deeper on how the fact today ideologies, of course, they can be not only produced but also disseminated, spread around and expressed in many different ways. I mean, it's a lot of change. There are so many developments, and how this dynamics affects the role that they have as transmitters of powers, since we go back to power.
Right. So I want just to talk about two themes. One is the relationship between ideology and power, and the other is the one that we've just heard about, is how, in a quite radical way, have ideologies changed over the past 30 or 40 years. So unquestionably, ideologies are forms of power. But that observation comes with two major reservations. First, they are not merely forms of power. That will be to impoverish a very rich set of thought practices. Ideologies are extraordinary means of human communication, of social imagination, and of collective commitment to an engagement with the world. And second, both ideology and power have got a bad reputation. The words have got a bad reputation. But power is not only domineering or oppressive or stultifying, and it isn't simply imposed externally on subalterns. Power is ubiquitous and it is indispensable. The society bereft of power is a society in a total state of paralysis. For example, the fact that I'm sitting here on this podium means that somebody exercised power on me to move me from Oxford to Rome. And this is a form of power's persuasion, power's influence. It wouldn't have occurred to me 2 months ago to do this. So power is making people...
It was not hard power.
Not yet, we'll see. I mean, it wouldn't, you see, so it wouldn't have occurred to me a couple of months ago to make this move. So power is always making people do something that they would not otherwise have done, or making groups or organizations, or even states, we can discuss this later, do something that they would not otherwise have done. So power is not limited to the domains of suppression or force, manipulation. Of course, it is all of those as well. It can be all of those as well. But it is more commonly entails words such as enabling, facilitating, acting, accomplishing, organizing, making something happen, as I said a moment ago, that would not otherwise have happened. Feminist theory from the 20th century is about the empowerment of women, which means giving them greater autonomy. So the word is a complex one that operates on many different levels. The second, and I should also say that power resides universally in language, the way we construct sentences, the way a newspaper, I know hardly anybody reads newspapers anymore, but I still do. The way newspapers are organized so that what happens on page 1 is shorthand of saying this is the most important thing that happened yesterday. Take notice, right? So there's the power even of the organization of material and the way the information flows. But I want to move to the second issue, which I think is particularly important nowadays. And that is, what is happening to ideology nowadays? In the 19th century, throughout most of the 20th century, ideologies were organized, they were compact, they were articulated in various ways. They made sense in terms of how the arguments were constructed. This seems to have disappeared. Ideologies are now in pieces, they're dismantled, they're fragmented, they're discontinuous. And there may be submerged continuities, but it's more likely to come across an ideology which is a very messy state of affairs. Now, what has happened? First of all, is something I would call de-intellectualization. Ideologies were, in an early phase, produced by intellectuals and designed for the consumption of intellectuals. I mean, Marxism did not express the voice of the people. Marxism was a way of how to express their voice from the people. So what we have nowadays are opinions that display serious arguments. And messiness, I'm quite in favor of messiness. I think the normal way that we think and live our lives is messy. And the challenge for a theorist such as myself is, how do we cope with messiness? How do we approach messiness? How do we approach the fact that normally the way we think about politics is disorderly, is sporadic, is discontinuous, has got gaps, has got discontinuities. So what ideologies seem to be doing is moving from slow cooking to fast food. The desire to consume something in a great hurry and then move on and forget about it. And then we have what I would call super atomization, which you find with the development of social media, where in a way everybody has his or her pennyworths of contribution to what ideological thinking is. They may not call it an ideology, but as a theorist of ideology, this is precisely what the ideologies are. They're ways of changing or continuing or arguing in favor or against a particular way of organizing the world or organizing a society or organizing other societies. So what we have in this extraordinary cacophony of individuated voices is a new form of ideology, what I would call a move from democratizing politics to demotic politics. Quasi-private, undiluted, and strident. And it is very difficult to discover patterns. But the fact that there are no patterns doesn't mean that you don't have ideologies. It just means that we have to devote more effort, more energy to understanding the way that patterns or the ways of thinking about our societies have developed, and to take them seriously. That's the whole point. About taking them seriously. They're not just background noise. They are the way in which people now reflect and express themselves politically. That has to be taken into account. Ideologies also lack what used to be their strong gravitational pull. You used to be attracted back to a particular pattern, a particular structure, a particular way of arguing and thinking that when had got names, let's say the names like liberalism or conservatism or fascism or green political thought or whatever. And this is now, I think, beginning to disrupt. It doesn't mean that ideologies are less important. It means that they're found in forms that we're not used to. And this is an immense challenge, I think, to research and thinking about the way that we think about politics and the way that politics is expressed. We have to move away from the old structures and patterns of what we expected ideologies to be and find them in a much more loose and even chaotic form. But as I said earlier, messiness, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but most of my life is messy. From time to time, I get organized on a very interim and temporary basis. But messiness is part of what we do and what we are, and it's also part of the way we think. And the final point about ideologies is that ideologies move across positions, or rather the particular ideas that an ideology has is now transferred to other ideologies. So everybody is now suddenly green. And whereas it is an easy mix or more difficult fit between, say, particular types of conservatism. Actually, conservatism is by nature associated with green political thought because it is about preservation, or to some extent, at least, about preservation. So you can see the conservative link. But ideologies now travel, or bits and pieces of ideology travel very loosely and continuously between different points. So I will stop at this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It's I think there is a lot for you on this idea of how ideologies are now turning today to be, or difficult to understand and to figure out, because this is not going to finish. It's going to be even more messy in the future. So it's also for you in the future to understand what is an ideology, how to define it. It was very much easier when I was 20, probably, you know, and even here in Rome, you had one side or the other side, more or less. And thank you for expressing. When you thought about the power, when you mentioned the power of the first page of a newspaper, I was thinking, what is the power of algorithms today? I mean, the power of getting, you know, the result of your search as first or second. So this power just changes the way it is presented, but it's always there, and somebody can use it. Yeah. In this case, it makes a lot. So this is now there are sciences like, you know, search engine optimization that you all know, I'm sure, which is really something extremely important if you want to be seen or known, or maybe it's a business. Anyway, I don't want to derail from this, and I see it's for. So I did my job properly as moderator, I think, but of course, before we close down, if you want, and I really would like to have any kind of reaction on anything we have said or we haven't said during this very interesting panel. So if you have questions or observation, this is the time. I know that it's always something scary, what you could say or not say. I think it's a good opportunity to exploit the nice panel that we have here. So I'm looking. We have one. Yes. Microsoft. The microphone is there. 1 and 2. Is that correct? Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. And hello, I'm Diego Del Valle from Global Governance, and I want to ask to Professor Frieden a question about you said in your first intervention about like the liberal West world, and you said that I want to concentrate on a detail you said because it shocked me a little that this.
Sorry, can you repeat?
My question is about a detail.
The detail, yes.
You said,
Yeah.
and it was about like this liberal Western world that is not led anymore by liberal forces. I didn't understand very well what you said because.
Okay, I shall try to explain. Should be one question at a time. Yeah. Well, if you look at the governments who are part of the liberal world order, they are not traditionally liberal governments, and they don't represent, and I say represent, liberal states. So what I meant is that that is one argument. So you find many conservative or socialist sometimes, or social democratic governments who claim to be part of the liberal world order. Well, so one wants to think, okay, let's look at this with a magnifying glass. Which part of the liberal world order do they represent? And again, as I said earlier, there are many liberalisms. So to talk about the liberal world order as a singular thing is, to my mind, far too general a term and very misleading sometimes. Well, it depends on how you stretch the word liberal. And this is a question of interpretation. You can have a maximalist or minimalist, any point between of what is necessary and what is optional to being described or classified as a liberal. And that's it's a moving belt. It's constantly shape-shifting.
I am sure that you can find many dictators claiming that they are liberals. At least no, I don't mention any name or anything. There's no need. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Francesco Alessandrini, and I just wanted to use the words of Mr. Frieden to redirect the question to all of you or anyone that want to answer. So you have said that since global issues often doesn't have global consequences, what could it be a mean or a tool used by the United Nations to engage more the interest or the in awareness of not directly involved countries?
We start. Okay, try again to clarify so that we can give proper questions. Yeah,
Yes.
with the microphone.
The sentence of Mr. Frieden was, often global issues doesn't have global consequences. Maybe there are regional consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So my question was, what could it be a mean or a tool used by the United Nations to increase the awareness of not directly involved countries?
Yeah, I mean, maybe as they think, I don't actually think I agree with so much with the argument, because it is true, of course, that a global challenge like climate change then translates into problems that are can be very local, like hurricanes, floods. They can also be much more than just local. They can even cover entire regions. But then, of course, the effect from there reverberates, and you get, migration, you get climate change related migration, you get economic consequences, you get political consequences due to the instability that's created. So in that sense, then there is a global reverberation. And the same with wars. I mean, wars, take place in parts of the world, but then to a certain extent, they implicate the rest of the globe as well. So in that sense, I'm not actually sure whether we really, need anything new in order, because the reverberations are already there. Maybe you want to specify more what you meant with saying.
Well, I'm
it's
talking
local.
about globalization or globalism. If this is an ideology called globalism, I'm not sure. And I'm saying that this actually misrepresents the way that global issues are acted out in the real world. Because although there may be issues that affect all of us globally, the way that people treat the notion of globalism in terms of policy is very, very particular and very, very partial, and very often in a competitive relationship with other forms of globalism, and because we are living, as I said earlier, we are living in a world of great inequality. And so when we talk about global politics or global occurrences, it affects people very, very differently. Quite obviously, people in low lying areas are much more susceptible to flooding than others, and you've got 100 other such issues. So, and the impact, for instance, of industrial and commercial interests on global issues is vast. And very often they are superior and have more power than governments to do something or to prevent or to resist something from being done. So what I'm really saying is that the whole issue of globalism, it sounds lovely, but it is very, very difficult to put into practice, because we are living on a planet that is fundamentally unequal in its provision and its distribution of resources. It's unequal. I mean, the problem of redistribution is how do we create a balance between the natural inequality that we experience on this planet? Some people are more subject to hurricanes, and others are more subject to food scarcity. How do we create something that will redress the balance? But it's, when I taught questions of distribution at Oxford, one of the questions I asked students was, if you live in a block of 20 stories high, should everybody pay equally for the elevator, for the lift? Or should the people who are on the ground floor say, look, we're not using the elevator, why should we use it? And people on the top are using much more electricity and they need spare parts much more frequently. So we have two ways of addressing this question of fairness or equality, because using the lift is never something that is actually equal in terms of who uses them. And the same applies to scarcity and redistribution of resources on the planet.
Interesting on the elevator. This is Jeffrey.
So, I mean, okay, my sort of take on sort of what's been said here is, I mean, yeah, there's lots of global challenges that we ask international organizations, international institutions to address, but they play out and have very different effects in different places, different contexts, different locales. So, are we asking too much of the international organizations to sort of tailor their policies or their interventions to particular local contexts? No, we're not. But the problem is the international organizations are, in actually doing this, are hamstrung by, going back to a lack of political will. Member states won't provide the resources, the money, to allow for more, whatever, nuanced implementation of policy in different contexts. Organizations get ideas, international organizations, that are just wrong about, something like peacekeeping, go back to DPKO and the UN, we do it the same way everywhere, which is sort of what they were doing when we got this big upsurge of civil wars and civil conflicts in the 1990s and early 2000s. that was wrong. The problem was coming from the international organization in that case, right? So there's multiple reasons at work here, but it ends up, the bottom line is, yeah, there are global issues and challenges, and we ask these international organizations to do it, and also to do it in a way that, you know, takes account of the differing contexts, specificities, and the like, but it's super hard for them to do that for the reasons I said.
Sorry, it's too tempting. I don't want to keep you too long, but I also wanted to add something, because what you said about the elevator, it's interesting. I think if you get into a block of flats in a condominium or a condo, whatever it is, when you get there or you buy a flat there are rules. So you buy the flats and you also get the rules. Or if it's new build, you agree with the others what are the rules. The point is that then you have to respect the rules, whatever they are. Well, that's what I said. If you build it new, then you will be the one who, if you buy it, and it's the same international organizations. Of course, you can try to change the rules if you have good reasons, but otherwise it's clear as it is. Otherwise, you change your flat. It's difficult to change.
Yeah, but to be fair,
it's not fair, but not necessarily fair. It depends. There you can play, you know, on what it is fair or it's not. But then we go somewhere else. But I would say the rules are set ahead. You cannot just then pretend that you don't like them, because otherwise you play a different game, which is something sometimes happens. And on the regional part of this, if I can shift. Let's not forget that there are regional or international organizations. I mean, I was working in the OSCE, which is the biggest regional international organization, and they take care of aspects, or they should take care. Even in the UN, there are regional organizations, and they should take care of problems or aspects which are maybe global, but they have, of course, a different perspective in that very region. So there is something which is already there. It's not working as it should, but it is there. It is there. There is something. Okay, sorry, too tempting to add this. If there are no other questions, I would close here. I thank you very much for having 15 minutes more of your time. And I thank, of course, our panelists for the very interesting session. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I remind you that now I think the books are over there or on the other room. Over there, if you are interested on the book. Thank you very much.